rapper Mr. Worldwide sent out an impassioned plea calling for help for Cuban protesters. This comes as the communist Cuban regime shuts down internet services amid mass civilian uprising. Drug overdose deaths rose nearly 30% last year, reaching nearly 95,000. Experts point to multiple factors behind it. And July 15th marks 1 year since a 17-year-old was behind a massive Twitter hack that compromised the accounts of 130 of the biggest names in the world and scammed over $100,000 in Bitcoin. Tune in to Deep Dive as we explore these topics and more. Hello and welcome. This is Deep Dive and I'm Tiffany Meier. Let's kick off with Cuba. Mr. Worldwide is also weighing in on the protests there.
While they're losing their lives over there literally for something that we wake up every day and appreciate, which is freedom. Because this is about freedom and it's about human rights.
And Senator Marco Rubio, himself of Cuban descent, says the protests all started with a song too. A song about liberty and the lies of a government under a tyrannical regime. Rubio says anyone in Cuba who listens to this song gets jailed. Many say it's about ending the embargo. Black Lives Matter issued a statement supporting the Cuba government, condemning the protesters and blamed it on the U.S. embargoes. The U.S. put an embargo on all trade going in or out since February 1962 under John F. Kennedy. That embargo also makes investors wary of putting money in Cuba. But many experts say that's not the sole reason for Cuba's struggles. Instead, they note the U.S.-Cuba issue goes back to the Cold War, when Fidel Castro overthrew the U.S.-backed government and implemented a Soviet-style centralized economy. Many say the issue falls under communism, with Rudy Giuliani firing back at the current administration, tweeting out, "Why are Biden and the Democrats so afraid to say the Cuban people are rising up against communism?" JFK once said, "Communism has sometimes succeeded as a scavenger, but never as a leader. It has never come to power in a country that was not disrupted by war or corruption or both." The White House press secretary said Wednesday they'll take the protests into account when reviewing U.S. policy towards Cuba.
And it was the largest protest we've seen in Cuba in a long time. That will obviously have an impact on how we proceed. So we will see how things develop in the days ahead and develop our policy responses accordingly.
And the head of the U.S. Agency for International Development was also asked about the protests during a Senate committee hearing.
What are the protesters in Cuba seeking, and what are the impediments to their getting it?
You only have to hear the cries on the street. People don't want to be repressed, and they want to enjoy individual dignity. And the regime denies them that.
So how is the situation in Cuba? Following the widespread protests, police are cracking down. According to Cuba's Ministry of Interior, one person died during clashes with police on Monday, and over 100 are either arrested or missing. Cuba's president said the protesters were the violent ones and that the government security forces are not committing human rights abuses. Despite the communist-run government's attempt at blocking internet and mobile service as a way to stop protesters from communicating, videos of protests and crackdowns continue to pop up across social media. Many shared by exiles and relatives in Florida, including Republican Senator Marco Rubio. Many who protested said they were exhausted by Cuba's chronic shortages. The government blames the lack of food and medicine on the U.S. trade sanctions. But Cuban exiles say it's Cuba's own crushing restrictions on private industry that have destroyed the island's economy. Cuba's president offered some rare self-criticism during Wednesday night's televised address. He said, "We also have to carry out a critical analysis of our problems in order to act and overcome and avoid their repetition." Up until now, he's been laying blame on the U.S.
We call on the government of Cuba to refrain from violence or attempts to silence the voice of the people of Cuba.
The U.S. and Cuba relations have been changing over the years. Under the Obama administration, embassies reopened and many U.S. restrictions eased in Cuba. But that changed.
The regime enriched itself. The Cuban people never saw any benefit from it.
The Trump administration reinstated travel regulations, sanctions, and named Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism. Despite campaign promises to go back to full diplomatic relations, the Biden administration has yet to take action. So far, the U.S. has not seen a spike of migrants from Cuba. That's according to Homeland Secretary Security Alejandro Mayorkas.
The time is never right to attempt migration by sea. Allow me to be clear. If you take to the sea, you will not come to the United States.
He says anyone intercepted will be returned to their home country. While governments figure out policies, some are taking things into their own hands. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis wants Floridian companies to provide internet to residents in Cuba. DeSantis held a roundtable with Republican lawmakers and members of the Cuban exile community in Miami Tuesday. The Florida governor pitched an idea to help Cuban people as they enter their third day of uprising.
What does the regime do when you start to see these images? They shut down the internet. They don't want the truth to be out. They don't want people to be able to communicate. And so one of the things I think we should be able to do with our private companies or with the United States is to provide some of that internet service via satellite. We have companies on the Space Coast that launch these things.
He did not provide details on how to turn on remote hotspots, but added he would make calls on what the options are to make it happen. DeSantis said everyone present agreed that the Cubans are not complaining about a lack of vaccine or for some tangential issue. He said they are revolting against a corrupt communist dictatorship that has ruled that island with an iron fist for over 60 years. Now, let's turn to drugs. Deaths from drug overdoses surged almost 30% to a new record high in 2020. Fentanyl and other opioids contributed to about 75% of those deaths. According to the CDC, almost 95,000 Americans died from drug overdoses in 2020. That's the highest number of overdose deaths ever recorded in a single year. Many experts blame the pandemic's stay-at-home orders for the record numbers. The director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse calls the deaths chilling. She says the pandemic created a devastating collision of health crisis in America. Recovered drug addict Arman Maddela says his relapse started with alcohol after he lost his job and was stuck at home all the time from the lockdowns. And he's not surprised by the increase in overdose deaths.
In the last few months alone, I personally know at least 7 or 8 people who have passed away from fentanyl overdose.
Maddela heard similar stories from other recovering addicts about how isolation led to their relapse.
People were stuck on their own in their houses. They didn't have any sort of fellowship activity or any way to get out and, do things for themselves.
He says his parents helped him get into a detox center, and then he got into a recovery program. After 7 months of intensive work and sober living, he graduated from Shoreline Recovery Center.
And upon graduation, Shoreline offered me a job as a house manager, and that was really exciting for me.
A study published last month found that lockdowns didn't save lives, partly because of higher overdose deaths. Michelle Holbrook lost her son to an overdose last year. She tells the Epoch Times she's upset officials deemed liquor stores essential businesses, but closed in-person sobriety meetings. And some experts worry that even more fentanyl is getting smuggled into the country this year because of the border crisis. And now let's move to the digital world. Lots happening in Twitter. Last year today, a 17-year-old orchestrated a massive Twitter hack that compromised the accounts of 130 of the most prominent people in the world and scammed over $100,000 in Bitcoin. But before we get into that, Twitter announced they are removing Fleets. The spin-off of Snapchat didn't work as well as it did for Instagram. Fleets are where stories disappear after 24 hours. Twitter says Fleets will leave August 3rd, adding working on some new stuff. We're sorry or you're welcome. Now, for several hours on July 15, 2020, Twitter seemed unable to do anything as many big-name accounts got seized. Names like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. The hack last year raised a number of issues, namely how a global social media platform with over 330 million monthly users could be easily hacked. The Twitter hack and Bitcoin scam added to the calls for tighter cybersecurity. Calls that many say were ignored, noting the slew of cybersecurity attacks that hit the nation's largest pipeline, hiking gas prices and causing shortages in the East Coast, and meat plant JBS, and the most recent U.S. IT firm Kaseya, with around 1,500 of its clients compromised around the world. The White House has ramped up cybersecurity measures since the Colonial Pipeline hacking. Last month, Biden signed an executive order after the Colonial Pipeline attack. Biden said that will help improve the nation's cybersecurity. It seeks to better equip federal agencies with cybersecurity tools. It also encourages the private sector, which operates much of the nation's critical infrastructure, to improve its own cybersecurity standards. Under the new order, a system will be enabled on federal networks to continually monitor and respond to cyber threats. It also creates a cybersecurity safety review board that will meet after major cyber attacks to analyze and make recommendations going forward. And what about government involvement in Twitter? Twitter released its transparency report Wednesday. In it, Twitter said verified accounts of nearly 200 journalists and news outlets on its platform faced over 350 legal demands from governments to remove content in the second half of 2020. That's a 26% increase from the first half of the year. The report notes Twitter removed 5 tweets. Most of those requests came from India, followed by Turkey, Pakistan, and Russia. Reuters notes that Twitter also received over 38,000 legal demands to take down various content. That's a 9% decrease compared to the beginning of 2020. Twitter followed through with nearly 30% of the demands. This comes as Twitter, along with other big tech giants, have been in the crosshairs as governments and lawmakers hit back with antitrust laws. Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey testified this March in Congress about misinformation. Facebook and Google CEOs also joined him. That hearing was called Disinformation Nation, social media's role in promoting extremism and misinformation. It came amid growing scrutiny on what role the companies played in the misinformation around the 2020 presidential election. Human rights organization Amnesty International issued a statement ahead of the hearing. Acting Deputy Director of Amnesty Tech, Joe Westby, said at the time, social media companies have failed to protect people from content on their platforms that incites violence or advocacy of hatred. And despite growing calls for action, users continue to be bombarded with highly targeted advertising, political messages, and propaganda. He went on to say these companies appeal to our emotions of fear and anger to keep us staring at our screens. Both Democrats and Republicans see removing the liability shield created by Section 230 as a way to make social media firms change their ways. Ahead of that hearing, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg argued that companies such as his should not be liable for content shared by users, as long as those companies followed best practices. At stake is what's known as Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. It's a 1996 law limiting the liability of internet platforms for content shared on their sites. While publishers can be held liable for any content they post, social media platforms are protected by Section 230, which states that no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. Both Democrats and Republicans see removing the liability shield created by Section 230 as a way to make social media firms change their ways. Both the Biden and Trump administration have criticized Section 230 for different reasons. Republicans accuse big tech companies of unbalancing policies of user content on social media platforms, stifling conservative viewpoints and free speech. Democrats argue the companies aren't doing enough to counter misinformation and hate speech. But what do you think? Let me know below. Thanks for tuning in to Deep Dive. I'm Tiffany Meier, and see you soon.